The words were still ringing in my ears when I stepped out of the great hall and into the cold night air. At this rate, you'll never get married. I stood on the stone steps for a long moment, the torchlight flickering behind me, casting long shadows across the frost-covered courtyard. My breath came out in small white clouds. Around me, the territory of Ashenvale stretched in every direction, dark forests pressing against the outer walls like a held breath, the kind of silence that only settles when something important has just been decided without you. I pulled my gray cloak tighter and told myself I wasn't embarrassed. I told myself that the warmth rising up my neck and into my cheeks was just the change in temperature. I told myself that an Omega standing in the middle of the AlphaKing's courtyard with her braid half undone and her dignity somewhere on the floor of the banquet hall was a perfectly normal situation. I almost believed it. My name is Clara. I am 23 years old. I am an Omega in a world that treats Omegas like decorative furniture. And I had just, in front of at least 60 wolves, 2 visiting pack delegates, and the entire High Council, told the most powerful alpha on the continent that he could only have me if he asked nicely. I closed my eyes. I should start from the beginning. Ashenvale was not the kind of place people chose to come to. It was the kind of place they were sent. Nestled between the Greymore Mountains and the Thornfield River, it had always existed at the edge of things, at the edge of maps, at the edge of political conversations, at the edge of relevance. 3 years ago, it had also been at the edge of collapse, before Alpha King Leander took the Northern Territories by force and reorganized everything under a single rule. I had come to Ashenvale 6 months ago as part of a diplomatic arrangement I had no say in. My home pack, the Silverfen, had negotiated a position for me at the king's estate. A record keeper, they called it. Because my memory for detail was the one thing even the alphas in my pack had never managed to dismiss. I cataloged supply routes, treaty documents, correspondence between packs. I was useful in the way that a very good lamp is useful, present, functional, easily overlooked. The other staff at the estate had treated me kindly enough. Soren, the head steward, a broad-shouldered beta with a permanent crease of worry between his brows, had shown me to my quarters on the first day with the particular gentleness people reserve for small animals they aren't sure will survive the winter. Petra, who managed the kitchens, had immediately decided I needed feeding and had made this her personal mission. And Davy, the youngest of the king's messengers, had attached himself to me with the loyalty of a puppy and the conversational persistence of someone who had been very bored for a very long time. None of them had warned me about the banquet. More specifically, none of them had warned me that the annual bonding ceremony banquet, a tradition in which unmated Omegas were formally presented to visiting alpha delegates as potential matches, would include me. I had found out this morning, when Soren had appeared at my record room door with a formal invitation card and an expression that suggested he was delivering news he personally disagreed with. "You're on the list," he'd said. "I'm on the wrong list," I'd replied. The king approved it himself. I had looked at the card for a long time. Then I had set it carefully on my desk, organized the documents I was working on into their proper stacks, and said very quietly, "I see." What I meant was, this is humiliating and I will not show it. The banquet hall of Ashenvale's main estate was built to impress. High stone arches draped in dark ivy, long tables set with candles that cast everything in amber and shadow, the smell of roasted pine resin and cedar smoke drifting from the fireplaces. Under other circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. Under these circumstances, I found myself standing in a line with 4 other Omegas, all of them looking varying degrees of resigned, while a herald read our names aloud to a room full of delegates who were evaluating us the way you evaluate horses at market. The visiting alphas were from the eastern packs, broad men and women with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to explain themselves to anyone. They smiled at each other across the tables and occasionally glanced at the line of us with polite, assessing interest. I kept my face completely still. And then Leander walked in. I had seen him before, of course, at a distance, crossing the courtyard, or moving through the estate's corridors with that particular stride that made people step out of his way without him ever asking them to. Up close, in the full weight of the banquet hall's candlelight, he was something else entirely. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller. Dark braids pulled back from his face, ice blue eyes that moved across the hall with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had to look for exits. He wore leather and fur the way others wore ceremony, and there was a faded scar along his left jaw that somehow made everything else about him more deliberate. He took his seat at the head table without looking at the line of us. I told myself I was relieved. The presentations proceeded. One by one, the herald called names, each Omega stepping forward to be acknowledged by the visiting delegates. There were polite words, practiced smiles, the choreography of tradition moving along exactly as designed. When the herald called my name, I stepped forward, and Leander looked up. It wasn't a long look. It wasn't even a particularly readable one. But it landed on me with the weight of something deliberate, a brief, precise attention, the way you look at something that has interrupted a thought you were already having. Then he looked away. The visiting Alpha to his right, a man named Gareth, broad and fair-haired, and evidently very pleased with himself, leaned toward me with a smile. Clara of Silverfen, a record keeper. He said it the way people say interesting weather when they mean nothing remarkable. Tell me, what does a record keeper do with herself at court? Does she sit in the corner and count things? There was low laughter at the table. I felt the flush climb my throat. And then Leander, without looking up from his wine, said, "At this rate, you'll never get married." The hall went quiet. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of observation a powerful man makes when he has stopped considering whether it will land. Offhand, half amused, the commentary of someone watching a scene he has no personal stake in. I felt something in my chest go very still. I looked at him. He still wasn't looking at me. He was turning the stem of his goblet between two fingers, and there was the faintest trace of something at the corner of his mouth that might have been a smile. "Only if you ask me," I said. The words came out quiet and even and completely without permission from the rational part of my brain. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Leander's hand stilled on the goblet. Slowly, very slowly, those blue eyes lifted and found mine across the table. And for the first time since I had arrived in Ashenvale, the AlphaKing of the Northern Territories was looking at me like I was something he hadn't accounted for. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then turned and walked out of the banquet hall with every ounce of composure I possessed. Which is how I ended up standing in the cold courtyard, shaking slightly, wondering if I had just made the worst mistake of my life. Behind me, through the thick stone walls, I could hear the hall beginning to murmur again. And somewhere inside that sound, if I listened carefully enough, I thought I could hear something that might have been laughter. His laughter. Low, surprised, and entirely real. I did not sleep well that night. My quarters were small but adequate. A narrow bed, a writing desk, a window that looked out over the eastern wall where the Thornfield River glinted like a ribbon of pewter in the moonlight. I lay on top of the blankets fully dressed for a long time, staring at the ceiling's stone seams, replaying the moment with the mechanical persistence of a mind that refuses to let embarrassing things rest. Only if you ask me. I pressed the back of my hand against my forehead and exhaled slowly. I had not planned that. There was no version of the evening I had imagined in which those words came out of my mouth with that particular steadiness, in that particular silence, in front of that particular audience. The rational part of me, the part that had survived years of being an Omega in a pack that valued Omegas primarily as symbols of cooperative alliance, knew exactly how that kind of remark landed in political spaces. Bold, presumptuous, reckless. The other part of me, the part that had watched Gareth laugh and seen Leander not correct him, thought, "Good." I was awake before dawn. The record room was on the second floor of the estate's administrative wing, a long, low-ceilinged space that smelled permanently of old parchment, ink, and the particular dustiness of things that have been important and then forgotten. I loved it with a fierceness I never admitted aloud. 3 walls of shelving, a wide table in the center, 2 windows overlooking the inner courtyard, and complete, reliable silence. I had barely lit the second lamp when the door opened. I expected Davi, who sometimes brought me tea in the mornings with the enthusiasm of someone delivering treasure. Instead, I got Soren, still wearing his formal steward's coat from the night before, crease between his brows deeper than usual. He closed the door behind him. "You're still employed," he said, which told me everything about how the previous night had been discussed after I left. "I assumed," I said, and went back to unrolling the supply ledger I'd been working on. Soren pulled out the chair across from me and sat heavily. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched me smooth the parchment flat, with the kind of attention I give things when I'm pretending I'm not waiting for someone to speak. "Gareth left this morning," he said finally. "Declined to make any formal bonding inquiries." "What a loss." "Clara." "Soren." I looked up. He was laughing at me. He was being informal. He was laughing at me, and the king joined in, and I said what I said. I'm not apologizing for it. Soren's mouth pressed into a thin line. He had the expression of a man who completely agreed with someone and was professionally prevented from saying so. He drummed his fingers once on the table, then stood. "The king wants to see you this morning," he said. "His study. 9th bell." He left before I could respond. I sat very still for a moment, then carefully, deliberately re-rolled the supply ledger and set it aside. 9th bell. The king's study. I had 2 hours. I spent those 2 hours working, because the alternative was catastrophizing, and I had learned long ago that catastrophizing was simply imagination without discipline. I organized 3 months of northern border correspondence into chronological order. I cross-referenced a livestock census against supply requests from 4 different subpacks. I rewrote 2 labels that had been smudged beyond legibility. When Davy finally appeared, breathless, tea in hand, eyes round with the particular excitement of someone who has been saving news, I let him talk. "Everyone is talking about what you said," he told me, dropping into the visitor's chair with the energy of a much younger person. Davi was 20, beta, with the kind of open face that broadcast every emotion before he decided whether to have it. "Petra says you were incredibly brave. Marin from the East Wing says you were reckless. Old Fen says—" "What does Fen say?" Davy grinned. "He says it's the most interesting thing to happen at a bonding ceremony in 40 years. Old Fen was the estate's senior historian and had the credibility of someone who had witnessed 40 years of bonding ceremonies." I was not sure whether this was reassuring. "What do you think?" I asked. Davi considered this with genuine seriousness, which was one of the things I liked best about him. "I think," he said carefully, "that the king laughed." He was laughing at me. "I was there," Davy said. "I was clearing the side table, and I heard it." He paused. It wasn't that kind of laugh. I looked at him for a moment. He met my eyes with the steady candor of someone who hasn't yet learned to be strategic about truth. Then the 9th bell rang, and I stood, straightened my cloak, and went to face whatever came next. The king's study was nothing like I'd imagined. I had expected something imposing, dark wood and mounted trophies, the visual language of dominance made architectural. Instead, it was cluttered, beautifully, chaotically cluttered, in the way of a space that is actually used by someone who thinks in it. Maps layered across the large central desk, some pinned with weighted stones, some half-rolled at the edges, books stacked in columns that defied structural logic, a brass instrument of some kind, navigational, I thought, sitting on the corner of the windowsill in a pool of gray morning light. The smell of cedar smoke and old paper and something faintly mineral, like mountain air. Leander was standing at the window when I entered, looking out over the courtyard below. He didn't turn immediately. I stood in the center of the room and waited, because whatever else I was patient. "You cataloged the Thornfield supply ledgers," he said, finally. Still not turning. It was not what I expected him to say. "Yes," I said. "Soren tells me you reorganized the whole archive system in your first 3 weeks." "The previous system was chronological without geographic indexing," I said. "Cross-referencing was inefficient." Now he turned, up close and in daylight, without the formal weight of the banquet hall around him. He was different. Not smaller exactly, but more specific. The scar along his jaw caught the pale winter light. His eyes were the precise blue of ice over deep water, and they settled on me with the same quality they'd had the night before. An attention that felt like it had traveled some distance to arrive. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't quite a statement. It sat in the air between us like something he was still deciding the shape of. "I'm appropriately cautious," I said. "I don't think that's the same thing." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. A recognition, maybe. Like hearing a word he'd been reaching for. He moved to the desk and leaned against the edge of it, not sitting behind it, I noticed, which would have been the power position. Just leaning, arms crossed, looking at me across the width of the room. "Last night," he said. "Last night," I agreed. "You understand that what you said, in that room, in front of those delegates, was impertinent," I said. "Yes." I was going to say unexpected. The word landed quietly. I kept my expression still, but something in me, some small and guarded thing, shifted almost imperceptibly. "Gareth was laughing at me," I said, because I thought it deserved to be said plainly, here, in a room without an audience. "You let him. And then you made it worse." A pause. Something in his jaw tightened. "I know," he said. I blinked. It was not what I expected. An AlphaKing, particularly one who had reorganized the Northern Territories through force of will and political precision, did not typically know things like that with such unadorned directness. "I was distracted," he added. "That's not an excuse. It was careless." I studied him for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the way his arms were crossed not in the closed posture of defense, but in the held-back posture of someone managing something internal. "All right," I said finally. He looked at me. "All right?" "You acknowledged it. I'm not interested in prolonging discomfort for its own sake." Another of those almost not quite smiles. "Soren said you were practical." "Soren says things like that as a compliment." "It is one." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want you to continue working on the archive, but I also want you cross-referencing the border reports with the supply chains. There are discrepancies I can't account for, and I need someone who can hold a large amount of detail in order simultaneously." I processed this. That's not record-keeping. That's analysis. Yes. That's not what I was sent here to do. "I know what you were sent here to do," he said. "I'm telling you what I need done." The blue eyes held mine steadily. "If you're willing." I thought about Silverfen, about being arranged into a banquet line, about the word only in a room full of laughter. "I'm willing," I said. He nodded once. Then, just as I turned to leave, "Clara." I paused. "The answer you gave last night." A beat. Something careful moving through his expression, like a current under still water. "I haven't decided yet what to do with it." I looked at him over my shoulder. "Neither have I," said honestly. and I walked out into the corridor, where the morning light was finally breaking through the high windows in long, pale columns, and I let myself breathe for the first time since the 9th bell rang. 3 weeks passed. They passed in the particular way that significant things sometimes do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a texture. Like fabric you keep running your fingers over without quite deciding what it is. The work Leander had given me was genuinely difficult, and I was genuinely grateful for it. In the private way, I was grateful for anything that required my full attention. The border reports came from 7 different sub-pack territories, each with their own recording conventions, their own abbreviations, their own particular habits of omission. Cross-checking them against the supply chains was like learning 7 dialects of the same language simultaneously, while also building the dictionary. I worked long hours. I didn't mind. What I minded slightly was that Leander kept appearing, not intrusively, not obviously, but with a consistency that I had started tracking the way I tracked discrepancies in the ledgers, noting the pattern, not yet drawing conclusions. He appeared in the record room doorway on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after our meeting in his study, holding a folded map that he said he needed cross-referenced with the river crossing data I'd been compiling. He stayed for 20 minutes, standing at the end of my work table, asking precise questions about supply volumes in the eastern corridor. I answered them. He left. I sat very still for a moment afterward, then went back to work. He appeared again 4 days later, this time with Soren, to review a set of correspondence I'd flagged as inconsistent. That visit was businesslike and brief. But at the end of it, as they were leaving, he paused at the door and said, without turning fully, "You reorganized the mountain garrison reports." "They were filed by messenger name," I said. "That's not a logical primary index." "No," he agreed. And then he left. On the 3rd occasion, he came alone, in the early evening, when the light through the record room windows had gone the particular gray-gold of dusk over mountains. He stood in the doorway for a moment before I noticed him, and when I looked up from the table, there was something in his expression that he replaced very quickly with neutrality. "I'm not interrupting," he said, which was technically a question. "You're the AlphaKing," I said. "You don't interrupt. You arrive." That got a real response. Not the almost smile I had catalogued from our previous interactions, but something fuller. Brief and quickly contained, but real. He came in and looked at the spread of documents on my table. "What did you find?" "Something you're not going to like," I said, and showed him. The discrepancy was in the grain records. It had taken me 2 weeks to find it precisely because it was subtle, the kind of subtle that suggested someone had been careful. 3 of the northern sub-packs were reporting supply receipts that matched their outgoing requisitions exactly. Not approximately. Exactly. Which sounds like efficiency until you understand that supply chains never work that way. There is always loss in transit. Weather, spoilage, counting error, the minor pilfering that exists in every large operation since the beginning of organized society. Perfect numbers, in logistics, mean invented numbers. Someone was falsifying records. Leander stood at my table for a long time after I walked him through it. I watched him read and reread the columns I'd laid out, watched the quality of his stillness shift from contemplative to something harder. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "Based on the pattern, at least 8 months. Possibly longer, but the earlier records are less complete. Before I consolidated the northern territories. The falsifications start approximately 3 months after consolidation," I said, "which suggests someone who adapted quickly to the new reporting structure." He looked at me. "You're saying someone inside the estate?" "I'm saying someone who understood the new system well enough to manipulate it from the first month it was in place." I paused. That limits the field considerably. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "I need you to not discuss this," he said, "with anyone." I assumed. "Not Soren, not Davi. No one until I tell you otherwise." Leander. It was the first time I had used his name without his title, and it came out naturally enough that neither of us marked it immediately. Then we both noticed. I continued anyway. I understand discretion. It's most of what I do. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, gathered the documents I'd marked, and left. I sat in the quiet of the record room for a long time after. The ember in my chest, the one I had been carefully not naming, burned a little steadier. It was Petra who first said it aloud. She said it on a morning when I had come down to the kitchens early, before the main household was awake, because I couldn't sleep, and the smell of bread baking had drifted up through the stone corridors like a summons. Petra was a wide, warm woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the unhurried confidence of someone who has fed important people long enough to stop being impressed by them. She handed me a bowl of something hot without being asked, sat across from me at the long kitchen table, and said, "He watches you, you know." I looked at my bowl. "I don't know what you mean," I said, which was the least convincing thing I had said since I'm not embarrassed in the courtyard 3 weeks ago. Petra smiled into her tea. "I've worked in this estate for 11 years. I've watched that man walk through every room in this building. He walks through rooms, Clara. He doesn't look at them." She paused. "He looks at you." I thought about the doorway, the evening light, the expression he'd replaced with neutrality before he thought I'd seen it. "He's watching my work," I said. Petra did not elaborate. She refilled my bowl without asking. The investigation moved quietly through the next week. Leander was careful in the way that powerful people are careful when they understand that carelessness costs more than caution. He did not change anyone's duties. He did not increase surveillance visibly. He simply began routing certain correspondence through me first, and I began building a secondary record, a private one, kept in a locked box he'd provided, of everything that didn't add up. The picture that emerged was uncomfortable in its specificity. The falsifications pointed to 3 people. Cade, one of the senior supply coordinators, a young alpha with quick eyes and a habit of watching doors. Rena, who managed Northern Territory requisitions and had the too smooth manner of someone who has been managing impressions for a long time. And a third presence, less visible in the records, more visible in the gaps, the places where information had been routed around rather than through. I brought my findings to Leander's study on a Thursday evening. He was at his desk this time, actually sitting behind it. Maps spread across the surface, a lamp lit against the early dark, his braids slightly loose from what must have been a long day. He looked up when I entered, and there was something in the unguarded moment before he composed his expression. Something that felt less like an AlphaKing, and more like a man who had been waiting for something, and was relieved it had arrived. I set my compiled notes in front of him and stood back. He read in silence. I watched the lamp flame lean in a draft from the window. "The third one," he said. "You can't identify them. No. But whoever they are, they knew the new system before it was formally distributed. That means they saw the consolidation documents early." I paused. "There are only 7 people who received those documents in the first circulation." He looked up. "I'm one of them." "Yes," I said. "And Soren." "And 5 council members." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not the neutrality he used in public, not the careful attention he used with me, but something underneath both of those. Something that looked, briefly, like exhaustion. "I've been running this territory for 3 years, he said quietly. "I've made enemies I expected and enemies I didn't." "I know," I said. "I don't always know who to trust." The words sat between us differently from anything else he'd said to me. Not strategic, not official, just true, in the plain way that things are true when someone has stopped performing and started speaking. "You trusted me with this," I said. "Yes. Why?" He looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up along the eastern wall, and I could hear it moving through the stone corridors of the estate like something looking for a way in. "Because you told me the truth in a room full of people who were waiting to see what you'd do," he said. "And you told it without fear." A pause. "That's rarer than you think." I held his gaze and felt the ember go still and bright. "I'll find the third person," I said. He nodded slowly. "I know you will." I gathered my notes and turned to go. At the door, I paused, not for effect, but because the thought arrived before I could stop it. "Leander." He looked up. "Whatever you decide to do when I find them, make sure it's justice, not just power." Something crossed his face that I didn't have a word for yet. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to be said to him. "Yes," he said softly. "All right." I went back to my record room in the dark, and I sat at my desk. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I found the third person on a Sunday. It wasn't dramatic. It rarely is, with things like this. The truth tends to arrive quietly, tucked inside something ordinary, visible only to someone who has been looking in exactly the right direction for long enough. I was cross-referencing the original consolidation document circulation list against the estate's internal messenger logs, tracing every hand the documents had passed through before their official distribution date, when I found a routing notation so small and so neatly placed that it looked like a clerical habit rather than a choice. The documents had passed through the council archive room. The council archive room was managed by a man named Aldrich. Aldrich was 61 years old. He had served 3 consecutive Alpha Kings before Leander. He had a quiet manner and a reputation for absolute institutional loyalty that everyone in the estate cited the way people cite weather, as background fact, too stable to question. He brought pastries to council meetings. He remembered the names of people's children. He was, in the precise way of certain very patient people, invisible. I sat with the notation in front of me for a long time. Then I locked it in the box, put on my cloak, and went to find Leander. He was in the training yard. I had never been to the training yard before. It was on the north side of the estate, separated from the administrative wing by 2 courtyards and a covered walkway, and it belonged to a part of the estate's daily life that had nothing to do with my work. I stood at the entrance for a moment, adjusting to the cold and the noise, and the particular contained violence of men sparring in winter air. There were 6 of them, and they were working through a rotation with the focused efficiency of people who did this every day without needing to be told why. I recognized 2 of the king's senior guards. The others were unfamiliar. Leander was in the center of it. I had understood, abstractly, that he was physically formidable. You don't consolidate 7 fractious northern territories through pure negotiation. But understanding it abstractly and standing 20 feet away watching it in practice were different experiences. He moved with a precision that didn't look like effort. Economical, deliberate, unhurried in a way that made his sparring partner look frenetic by comparison. He saw me before I said anything. He ended the rotation with a word to his partner, reached for the cloth draped over the yard fence, and walked toward me. His breath came in short, controlled clouds. There was a flush along his cheekbones from the cold and the exertion, and he looked, for the first time since I had known him, completely unguarded. "Clara." He read my expression immediately. "You found something." "I found someone," I said quietly. He was still for a moment. Then he nodded once, said something brief to the nearest guard, and led me inside. I told him in the corridor off the training yard, standing in the narrow space between a weapons rack and a high window, because there was no time to go to the study, and the information felt too heavy to carry any further than necessary. When I said Aldrich's name, Leander went very still. Not the controlled stillness I had come to recognize. The held-back, managed quality of a man who processes things internally before responding. this was something different. Something older. The stillness of someone receiving a blow they had, somewhere beneath consciousness, been bracing for. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Certain enough to bring it to you, not certain enough to act without review." I held out the notes. "It's all here." He took them, read them slowly in the bad light of the corridor window, while I stood and waited, and did not fill the silence with anything, because some silences deserve to be left whole. When he finished, he folded the notes carefully and held them at his side. "He served my father," Leander said quietly, "and my father's predecessor." "I know. I trusted him with the consolidation documents because he was the one person I thought was genuinely beyond personal interest. Old enough, settled enough." He stopped, jaw tight. "I was wrong. You weren't reckless," I said. "You made a reasonable assessment based on available evidence. The evidence was incomplete." He looked at me. "You're being kind. I'm being accurate. There's a difference, and I think you know it." A pause. "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something move through him. Not anger, exactly, though I thought that was present underneath. Something more complicated. The particular weight of betrayal by someone you had genuinely believed in. "What you said," he said finally. "Justice, not just power." His eyes found mine. I remember. What followed was careful and quiet, and took 4 days. Leander brought 2 people into his confidence. Soren, whose reaction to Aldrich's name was a long, controlled silence followed by a single, devastated exhale, and a woman named Voss, the estate's senior legal authority, compact and sharp-eyed, and entirely without sentimentality. Together, the 4 of us, because Leander included me without making it a question, built the formal record of evidence that would stand before the council. Those 4 days had a strange quality to them. Urgent and close, the way weather feels before it breaks. We met in the evenings in Leander's study, the 4 of us around the desk while the fire burned low and the wind moved through the stone corridors outside. Soren brought tea nobody drank. Voss asked precise questions and wrote the answers in her small, vertical hand. Leander directed the process with the same unhurried precision I had watched in the training yard. Economical, deliberate, leaving nothing to chance. And me? I organized. I cross-referenced. I found the threads and handed them to the people who knew how to pull them. On the second evening, when Soren and Voss had gone, and it was just the 2 of us in the study with the fire and the accumulated paperwork of 4 months of quiet wrongdoing spread across the desk, Leander said, without preamble, without looking up from the document he was reading, "I owe you an apology." I looked up. "For what specifically?" "The banquet." He set down the document, met my eyes. "You were brought here to do work that I then reduced to a social presentation. And I made a comment that was thoughtless. And when it was turned into something worse by Gareth, I didn't stop it." A pause. "You deserved better than that. From this house, and from me specifically." I held his gaze for a long moment. "Yes," I said. "I did." Something in his expression shifted. A careful, quiet respect. The kind that arrives when someone accepts accountability without negotiating the terms. "I'm saying it plainly," he said, "without condition. I know. I set down my own work, and I'm accepting it plainly, without condition." The fire crackled. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning. I could see it against the dark window, falling soft and steady and indifferent to everything happening inside. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "The banquet comment. The one about marriage." I watched him carefully. "Was it actually thoughtless?" A pause. "No," he said. He said it quietly, looking at the fire rather than me. Not entirely. I waited. I noticed you the moment you stepped into the line, he said. You were the only one who looked like you were somewhere else entirely and fully present at the same time. Like you were observing it from a remove while also living it. He paused. I said something careless because I didn't know what else to do with that. The fire crackled again. I thought about that for a moment. The strange sideways logic of it. The powerful man who handles everything with precision, thrown momentarily off balance by a woman in a gray cloak who refused to look like she needed the room to validate her. That, I said carefully, is the most convoluted way I have ever heard someone admit to being nervous. He looked at me sharply. And then he laughed. The same laugh I had heard briefly through the banquet hall walls on the night all of this began. Low, surprised, entirely real, and this time directed at me rather than about me. It changed the room completely. Aldrich was brought before the council on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks to the day after my first meeting in Leander's study. The evidence was presented by Voss, methodically and without drama. Aldrich listened with the stillness of someone who had known this was coming for longer than anyone else in the room. When the presentation concluded, he looked at Leander across the council table and said quietly, I thought the consolidation was a mistake. I thought the territory would hold better under distributed leadership. I was trying to prevent what I believed was a structural error. You were falsifying records and diverting resources, Leander said. Yes. For 8 months. Yes. Leander was quiet for a moment. You should have come to me. Aldrich's expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, into something that looked almost like grief. You remind me of your father, he said. I didn't trust your father either. The room was very still. That, Leander said, is the most honest thing you've said since you walked in. Aldrich was removed from his position. Given the length of his service and his age, Leander chose formal censure and banishment from Ashenvale territory over harsher measures. Voss recorded the ruling. The council acknowledged it. Justice, not just power. As the council filed out, I stood near the back of the room where I had observed the proceedings. Cade and Rena had been dealt with the previous day, reassigned to monitored positions in distant subpacks, their careers effectively over, their futures significantly narrowed. The supply chain falsifications would take months to fully untangle. But the structure was sound, the gaps were identified, and the territory would heal. Leander crossed the room toward me as the last council member left. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me with that quality of attention I had been cataloging since the beginning, but clearer now, less guarded, less carefully managed. It's done, he said. It's done. I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the council hall windows, the snow that had started 2 nights ago was still falling, slow and steady, covering the courtyard in white. I want to show you something, he said, if you're willing. He took me to the East Tower. It was the highest accessible point of the estate, reached by a narrow stone staircase that wound upward for what felt like a very long time. At the top, a door opened onto a wide stone platform, open to the sky, looking out over the full sweep of Ashenvale territory, the dark forests, the Thornfield River, the mountain range beyond, all of it muffled now under the fresh white of snow, stretching to every horizon under a sky the color of old pewter. It was extraordinary. I stood at the edge of the platform and felt the cold settle around me like a held breath, and looked out at the territory that this complicated, precise, unexpectedly careful man had built. And I understood for the first time what it must feel like to be responsible for all of it. I come here when things are difficult, he said, standing beside me. Not close, just beside. I can see why, I said. When I was consolidating the Eastern Packs 3 years ago, I spent a week up here. mapping, planning, trying to see the whole thing at once. I looked at him. The wind moved through his braids. The scar along his jaw caught the pale winter light. Did it help? Seeing it whole? He considered this honestly. Yes. And no. You can see the shape of a thing from a distance, but you can't feel its weight until you're inside it. I thought about record rooms and supply ledgers and the way truth hides in the gaps of things. That's what you needed me for, I said slowly. Not just the analysis. You needed someone inside it who could see the shape of it too. He looked at me, and in his expression was something I recognized now. The thing I had watched him replace with neutrality, over and over, since the beginning. Except this time he didn't replace it. Among other things, he said quietly. The snow fell around us, soft and relentless and entirely beautiful. My heart was doing something I was no longer pretending not to notice. Leander, I said. Clara. We stood there in the snow and the cold and the vast quiet of Ashenvale, and neither of us said the thing that was sitting right there between us. Not yet. Not today. But we both knew it was there, solid and real as the stone beneath our feet. And for now, that was enough. Winter settled over Ashenvale the way it always did. Not suddenly, but with a slow, deliberate certainty that made you realize, one morning, that it had been there for a while already. 2 months passed after the council hearing. 2 months of work and snow and the particular rhythm that develops between people who spend a great deal of time in the same spaces doing serious things together. The supply chain investigation continued. Untangling 8 months of falsified records required the kind of sustained attention that I was well suited to. And Leander gave me the resources and authority to do it properly. I expanded the record room, requisitioned 2 assistants, and built an indexing system that I was genuinely proud of in the private, quiet way I was proud of most things. Davi was one of my assistants. He accepted the role with a solemnity that lasted approximately 4 hours before giving way to his natural state of cheerful commentary on everything happening in every corner of the estate. I found I didn't mind. It turned out that useful information moved through Davy the way water moves through stone. Not always where you'd expect, but thoroughly. Petra continued to feed me. I continued to let her, because the alternative was eating alone in the record room, and because her kitchen had become the kind of place where I felt, without ceremony or announcement, at home. Soren and I had developed the working relationship of 2 people who respect each other's competence and have too much to do to waste time on anything else. He was brisk, reliable, and occasionally, when something went wrong with the kind of elegant bad timing that administrative life specializes in, he would appear in my doorway with an expression that said, "This is your problem now," and I would say I assumed and we would get to work. It was a good life. A real one. The kind you build out of small dailies rather than grand gestures. And Leander was present in the way he had been from the beginning. Consistent and deliberate and growing, incrementally, less careful with me. The thing happened on a Tuesday evening in late winter, which I mention only because nothing important should happen on a Tuesday evening, and yet they almost always do. I was in the record room, late, lamp burning low, the last of the day's supply corrections spread across the table, when I heard quick footsteps in the corridor, and Davi appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, and wearing the expression he reserved for genuinely urgent news. "Delegate from the southern reaches," he said. "Arrived an hour ago, unannounced." I looked up. "What kind of delegate?" "The kind with 12 riders and a formal compact seal." He paused. "And a bonding proposal." I set down my pen. "For whom?" Davi met my eyes with the careful steadiness he had borrowed, I suspected, from watching me handle things I didn't like. "For the king," he said. "From Alpha Lady Celine of the Southreach packs. She's here herself." I sat with that information for a moment. "All right," I said. "Clara?" Thank you, Davi. I straightened the documents in front of me, organized them into their proper stacks, and reached for my lamp. Go home. Get some sleep. He lingered. Are you? I'm fine, I said, which was a word I had stopped using carelessly months ago, so when I used it now, it meant something specific. I will be. And in the meantime, I don't need assistance with it. He went. I sat in the darkening record room for a while longer. I was not entitled to feel what I was feeling. Leander had made no promises. We had stood in the snow on the East Tower and said nothing, and I had told myself that was enough, and I had meant it. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and I was an Omega record keeper from a minor pack who had been sent here as a diplomatic arrangement I'd had no say in. The architecture of our lives had never been designed with anything else in mind. I knew this. I also knew that none of it quite explained away the particular quality of cold that had settled in my chest since Davy said the word bonding proposal. I put on my cloak and went to bed. I did not see Leander for 3 days. This was, in the practical logic of the estate, completely explainable. A formal diplomatic visit required his full attention, meetings with the delegate party, formal dinners, the careful protocol of pack alliance negotiations. Soren was everywhere at once, visibly managing 17 things simultaneously. The estate was in the heightened, slightly pressurized state of a household performing its best version of itself for an audience. I worked. I kept my head down. I cataloged and cross-referenced and organized with the focused efficiency of someone who is using productivity as a very respectable emotional management strategy. On the second evening, Petra brought me supper in the record room, sat across from me, and didn't say anything. She just poured the tea and let the silence be companionable, and I was more grateful for it than I knew how to say. On the third morning, Celine walked through the administrative wing. I saw her through the record room window. She was crossing the inner courtyard below, accompanied by 2 of her riders. She was striking, tall, dark-haired, with the unhurried ease of someone who knows precisely the value of their own entrance. She moved through the courtyard like she was already familiar with it, and she looked up at the estate's main building with an assessing expression that had very little uncertainty in it. I watched her for a moment. Then I went back to my work. Leander appeared in my doorway that afternoon. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not physically, but in the deeper way of someone who has been managing competing pressures for too long without a break. His braids were neat, and his expression was composed, but his eyes, when they found mine, had the quality of a man arriving somewhere he'd been trying to get to for a while. I should have come sooner, he said. You were occupied, I said. It's a diplomatic visit. Clara. I set down my pen and looked at him properly. He came in and closed the door, which he had never done before. He stood in the center of the room, not at the end of my table, not leaning in the doorway, but in the middle of the space, where the lamplight reached him fully, and he looked at me with no neutrality whatsoever. I want to tell you about Celine, he said. You don't have to. I want to. A pause. Her pack is proposing a formal alliance through bonding. It's a strategically sound proposal. It would consolidate the southern corridor and remove 3 ongoing territorial tensions in one arrangement. He stopped. I've been sitting in meetings about it for 3 days. I know, I said quietly. I haven't agreed to it. I was still. I haven't agreed to it, he said again, because every time I sit in those meetings and they discuss the arrangement, I think about a woman who stood in a banquet hall and told the truth in a room full of people who were waiting to see what she'd do. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. And I think about how she held my gaze across a table without flinching, and how she told me that justice matters more than power, and how she stood next to me in the snow on the East Tower and didn't say the thing we were both thinking, and somehow that silence was the most honest conversation I'd had in years. The record room was very quiet. Outside, The winter light was the particular white-gray of late afternoon, pressing through the windows and lying flat across the table between us. "Leander," I said softly. "I know what I am," he said. "I know the weight of this territory and what it requires. I know that a bonding arrangement for an AlphaKing is never entirely personal, and I have never pretended otherwise." He paused. "But I also know that I have been making excuses to come to this room for 2 months, and that the most reliable part of every difficult day has been the knowledge that you were here, and that eventually I would find a reason to stand in this doorway." He looked at me steadily. "I don't want to make excuses anymore." I stood up slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and set something on the table between us, a small folded piece of paper. I looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Open it." I unfolded it. It was a single line in his handwriting, precise and unhurried. "I am asking." I read it twice. Then I looked up, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen from him. No neutrality, no management, nothing held back or carefully placed. Just a man asking a real question and waiting, without certainty, for a real answer. "You're asking," I said. "I am," he said, clearly, without condition. I thought about Silverfen, where I had been arranged and presented and overlooked. I thought about a banquet hall and 60 wolves, and the words that had come out of my mouth before I could stop them. I thought about 2 months of lamplit evenings and supply ledgers and East Tower snow and a laugh that had changed the quality of a room. I thought about what I had become in this place. Not the Omega sent as a diplomatic arrangement, but Clara, who reorganized systems that didn't work and found the truth in the gaps of things and told a king that justice mattered and meant it. "Yes," I said. One word. Quiet and complete and entirely certain. Something moved through his expression. Relief and warmth and something older than both. And he closed the distance between us and took my hand. And we stood there in the record room in the white winter light, while Ashenvale went on existing around us in all its complicated, fractious, demanding reality. The formal announcement was made the following week. The council received it with varying degrees of surprise, political calculation, and in Old Fenn's case, visible satisfaction. Celine departed with her delegation 2 days before the announcement. She had learned of Leander's decision privately and had responded with the cool grace of someone who had other options and intended to use them. There was no hostility. There was, I thought, a mutual recognition between two people who understood the weight of practical realities and had decided, each for their own reasons, that this particular arrangement was not the one. The sub-pack delegates had opinions. They always had opinions. There were those who saw an Omega record keeper from a minor pack as an inadequate political match for a king. Leander addressed those concerns directly and without apology in 2 council sessions that Soren described to me afterward as efficient. Davy was unreservedly delighted. He told me this with such specific happiness that I felt it was fair to hug him briefly, which surprised him, and then made him beam. Petra cried a little, and immediately began planning a feast. I told her it was too early for a feast, and she told me that it was never too early for a feast, and began planning it anyway. The bonding ceremony was held in the first week of spring. Not in the banquet hall. Leander had chosen the East Tower platform, which was smaller and less formal and made certain counselors quietly uncomfortable, which neither of us minded at all. The sky that morning was the pale, clear blue of early season, and the snow had mostly gone from the courtyard below, though it still clung to the mountain peaks in the distance, white and permanent against the horizon. Soren performed the formal words with his characteristic precision and the slight brightness around his eyes that he would have denied if asked. When it was done, Leander took my face in his hands, careful, unhurried, entirely deliberate, and the morning light fell across us both, and the territory spread in every direction below, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, the specific peace of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because I had been arranged there, because I had spoken the truth in a room full of people and let it land where it needed to land, and then I had done the work, and then I had waited, and then I had said yes to a man who had learned, somewhere between a banquet hall and a snow-covered tower, to ask. The supply chain records were fully corrected within 6 months. Ashenvale's northern border disputes were resolved through 3 successive negotiated agreements, the framework for which I helped draft. Cade rebuilt something of a career in a distant eastern subpack, which Voss tracked from a distance with the dispassionate thoroughness of someone keeping score. Rena did not. Aldrich lived out his remaining years quietly in a village west of the Greymore Mountains, and Leander sent him a formal letter on the anniversary of each year of his service. A small, precise acknowledgement of what had been real before it went wrong. Davi was promoted to senior messenger, which gave him access to more information, and therefore more things to tell me, which he did with unchanged enthusiasm. Petra's feast was extraordinary. Old Fen wrote it into the estate's formal record as the most interesting bonding arrangement in 43 years, which I felt was an upgrade from 40. Soren, when I thanked him one evening for the particular steadiness he had shown through all of it, looked at me for a moment and said, "You were always going to be all right, you know. I saw it the first day." "What did you see?" I asked. "Someone who was upset," he said plainly, and intended to be useful anyway. Years later, when the East Tower had become a place we went together in the way of all chosen habits, on difficult days, on good ones, on ordinary evenings when the light was doing something worth seeing, I would sometimes think about a girl who had stood in the cold courtyard after a banquet with her dignity on the floor and her braid half undone, and told herself she wasn't embarrassed. She had been, a little. But she had also been right, about almost everything.